The morning mist hung low over the sprawling grounds of Royal Lodge as Prince Andrew stepped onto the terrace, coffee cup in hand. The silence that surrounded him was different now, heavier, more loaded with meaning than it had been just months before. Where once he had enjoyed the peaceful mornings as a Duke of York, now he faced them as simply Andrew Windsor, a man whose titles had been stripped away like autumn leaves in a harsh wind. Royal Lodge had been his sanctuary for more than 2 decades. The grand mansion, with its 30 rooms and 98 acres of pristine Windsor Great Park, represented everything he had once been and everything he was fighting to remain. But the question that haunted him each morning was simple yet devastating. How much longer could he call this place home? The path that led to this moment began long before the recent headlines. It started in the corridors of power, in whispered conversations between palace officials, and in the careful calculations of a monarchy trying to modernize itself while protecting its reputation. Andrew had always been the spare, the second son who lived in the shadow of his older brother Charles. But being spare came with privileges, titles, properties, and a lifestyle funded by the crown. Royal Lodge itself tells a story of British royal history. Built in the early 18th century, it had housed everyone from King George IV to the Queen Mother. When Andrew moved in during 2003, it felt like destiny. The lease agreement he signed with the Crown Estate was for 75 years, running until 2078. At the time, it seemed like a lifetime, more than enough to see him through to his final days. The financial arrangement was complex but favorable to Andrew. He paid just £250 per week in rent, a sum that would barely cover a modest flat in central London, let alone a mansion of this magnitude. In return, he committed to spending millions of his own money on renovations and maintenance. It was a deal that made sense for everyone involved. The Crown Estate got a property that would be beautifully maintained, and Andrew got a home worthy of his status as a working royal. But status, as Andrew was learning the hard way, could be taken away much faster than it could be built. The renovations had been extensive and expensive. Andrew poured £7.5 million into bringing Royal Lodge up to modern standards while preserving its historical character. New roofing, updated electrical systems, modernized kitchens and bathrooms, and carefully restored period features. Every detail reflected his vision of creating not just a home, but a legacy. The gardens received equal attention. Andrew worked with landscape architects to create outdoor spaces that honored the property's history while serving modern needs. Rose gardens bloomed where Georgian nobles once walked. A helicopter landing pad was discreetly positioned to allow for official travel. Tennis courts and riding facilities catered to the recreational needs of a working royal family. Sarah Ferguson, his ex-wife, had been a constant presence throughout the renovation years. Despite their divorce in 1996, they had maintained an unusual but effective co-parenting arrangement. Sarah lived at Royal Lodge too, occupying her own wing of the mansion. Their daughters, Beatrice and Eugenie, had grown up running through these halls and now brought their own children to visit their grandfather in the same rooms where they had once played. This family dynamic was one of Andrew's strongest arguments for staying. Royal Lodge wasn't just his home. It was the family seat for his daughters and their children. Beatrice's daughter Sienna and Eugenie's sons August and Ernest knew Royal Lodge as their grandfather's house, the place where Christmas mornings happened and summer afternoons stretched endlessly across manicured lawns. But the walls that had once provided security now felt like they might be closing in. The financial pressures were mounting in ways that even Andrew, with his business connections and royal pension, was struggling to manage. The annual costs of maintaining Royal Lodge were estimated at around £400,000 per year. For a working royal with access to duchy income and official support, such expenses were manageable. For a private citizen, even one with substantial personal wealth, they represented a significant burden. The heating bills alone were staggering. The mansion's period features, while beautiful, were not designed with energy efficiency in mind. Large windows, high ceilings, and age insulation meant that keeping Royal Lodge comfortable during British winters required substantial resources. The gardens and grounds required a full-time staff of groundskeepers, and the property security needs, essential for any member of the royal family, titled or not, added another layer of ongoing expense. Insurance costs had also begun to climb. As Andrew's public profile became more controversial, insurers viewed Royal Lodge as a higher-risk property. The combination of a high-profile resident, valuable contents, and potential for protest or media attention made coverage more expensive and harder to obtain. These practical concerns were becoming real financial pressures that threatened his ability to maintain his current lifestyle. Meanwhile, King Charles was implementing his vision of a slimmed-down monarchy with ruthless efficiency. The new reign had brought fresh priorities and different approaches to managing royal resources. Where Queen Elizabeth II had sometimes allowed sentiment to influence practical decisions, Charles was proving more businesslike in his approach to family matters. The king's advisors had been quietly reviewing all Crown Estate arrangements involving family members. Royal Lodge represented exactly the kind of arrangement that seemed outdated in the modern monarchy Charles was building. Here was a property suitable for a senior working royal being occupied by someone who no longer held that status, at a rent that bore no relationship to its true market value. Frogmore Cottage had been suggested as an alternative. The 5-bedroom property in Windsor Great Park would provide Andrew with a comfortable home while freeing up Royal Lodge for purposes more aligned with current royal needs. The cottage had been recently renovated for Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, though they had barely occupied it before their departure from royal duties. It was available, appropriate for Andrew's new status, and much more affordable to maintain. But the suggestion felt like exile to Andrew. Moving from Royal Lodge to Frogmore Cottage would be a visible step down, a public acknowledgement that his circumstances had fundamentally changed. For someone who had spent his entire adult life as His Royal Highness, the Duke of York, such symbolism mattered enormously. The public relations aspect of any potential move was complex. Royal watchers and media commentators were already speculating about Andrew's future arrangements. Some argued that allowing him to remain at Royal Lodge sent the wrong message about accountability and consequences. Others suggested that forcing him out would appear vindictive and could backfire by generating sympathy for a man who had already lost his titles and public role. Sarah Ferguson's presence at Royal Lodge complicated any potential move. As Andrew's ex-wife, she had no formal claim to royal accommodation, but their ongoing relationship and co-parenting responsibilities made her situation relevant to any decisions about the property. Moving Andrew might also mean displacing Sarah, creating additional family tensions and practical complications. The staff at Royal Lodge found themselves in an increasingly awkward position. Many had worked for Andrew for years, developing personal loyalty alongside professional obligations. But they were also aware that their long-term job security depended on decisions being made far above their level. The uncertainty was palpable in their daily routines, though they maintained their professionalism while privately wondering about their futures. Local suppliers and service providers faced similar uncertainties. The Royal Lodge account represented significant business for everyone from security firms to garden centers to specialty food suppliers. Any change in Andrew's circumstances would ripple through the local economy, affecting people who had nothing to do with royal politics, but whose livelihoods depended on the current arrangements. Andrew's business interests provided some financial foundation for his fight to stay at Royal Lodge. His connections in international trade and business development had generated income streams beyond his royal pension. However, the same controversies that had cost him his titles had also made some business relationships more difficult to maintain. Corporate partners who had once valued royal association now viewed it as potentially damaging to their own reputations. The golf course at Royal Lodge held special significance for Andrew. An accomplished player, he had spent countless hours on the private course, often using it for informal business meetings and family recreation. The course represented not just a recreational facility, but a tool for maintaining the relationships and lifestyle that had defined his adult years. Losing access would mean more than giving up a hobby. It would mean losing a piece of his identity. His military connections remained strong despite his changed circumstances. Fellow veterans and service organizations continued to respect his combat service in the Falklands War and his later military roles. These relationships provided both emotional support and practical assistance as he navigated his new reality. Some of his strongest advocates came from military circles, arguing that his service record deserved consideration in any decisions about his future. The racing stables associated with Royal Lodge represented another complication. Andrew's involvement in horse racing had been both personal passion and business interest. The facilities at Royal Lodge allowed him to maintain horses and pursue breeding interests that connected him to one of the royal family's most enduring traditions. Moving would mean either giving up these interests or finding alternative arrangements that might be far more expensive. As winter approached, the costs of maintaining Royal Lodge became even more apparent. The heating systems worked overtime to keep the mansion comfortable, while the gardens entered their dormant phase under the care of year-round staff. These seasonal rhythms had been part of Andrew's life for 2 decades, but now each expense felt like a burden rather than a natural part of his lifestyle. The security arrangements at Royal Lodge were complex and expensive. Even without official royal status, Andrew remained a potential target due to his family connections and public profile. The security measures required to keep him safe at such a large, exposed property were substantial and ongoing. These costs were increasingly falling on Andrew personally rather than being covered by official protection arrangements. His daughters visited regularly, bringing their children to spend time with their grandfather in the home where they had grown up. These family moments provided Andrew with his strongest emotional arguments for staying. Royal Lodge wasn't just his home. It was the family gathering place, the location where traditions were maintained and new memories created. The thought of disrupting these patterns was painful for a man who had already lost so much. The legal aspects of the lease agreement provided some protection for Andrew's position. The 75-year lease was a binding contract that couldn't be easily broken without cause. As long as he met his financial obligations and maintained the property appropriately, he had strong legal grounds for remaining. But legal rights and practical pressures were different things, and Andrew was learning that lesson in increasingly difficult ways. The Crown Estate's position was delicate. While they had the legal authority to enforce lease terms, they also had to consider the broader implications of any actions involving a member of the royal family. The organization prided itself on commercial objectivity, but royal family matters inevitably involve considerations beyond pure business logic. Media attention intensified Andrew's isolation at Royal Lodge. Photographers with long lenses regularly positioned themselves at the estate boundaries, hoping to capture images that might reveal details about his current lifestyle or emotional state. This constant surveillance made even simple activities like walking in the gardens feel exposed and uncomfortable. The village of Windsor Great Park had been Andrew's community for 20 years. Local shopkeepers, service providers, and neighbors had grown accustomed to his presence as a part of their daily landscape. Some remained supportive, viewing him as a neighbor rather than a public figure. Others had grown uncomfortable with the attention his presence brought to their quiet community. As autumn turned to winter, Andrew faced the reality that his fight for Royal Lodge was far from over. The financial pressures would only increase as the property's heating and maintenance needs peaked during the cold months. Each day brought new challenges and new questions about whether his determination to stay was sustainable in the long term. The evening light cast long shadows across the Royal Lodge gardens as Andrew stood at his window, looking out over the grounds that had been his domain for so long. Tomorrow would bring new pressures, new questions, and new challenges to his ability to maintain the lifestyle he had known for decades. But tonight, at least, he was still the master of Royal Lodge, still fighting to preserve not just a home, but a way of life that represented everything he had been and everything he hoped to remain. The first serious meeting about Andrew's future took place in the king's private office at Buckingham Palace on a gray February morning. Charles had finally decided that the situation at Royal Lodge could no longer continue without formal discussion. The meeting included the king's private secretary, the keeper of the privy purse, and a representative from the Crown Estate. Andrew arrived alone, his usual confidence replaced by visible tension. The conversation began diplomatically, but quickly became direct. Charles explained his vision for a more focused monarchy, one where resources were allocated based on current roles rather than past titles. Royal Lodge, he argued, was too grand for someone no longer performing royal duties. The Crown Estate representative presented detailed financial analysis showing the true cost of Andrew's occupancy. Not just the nominal rent he paid, but the opportunity cost of keeping such a valuable property occupied by a non-working royal. Andrew's response was passionate and detailed. He had invested millions in the property, he argued, transforming it from a deteriorating mansion into a showcase worthy of the Crown Estate portfolio. His lease agreement was legally binding and had decades remaining. More importantly, Royal Lodge was his family home, where his daughters had grown up and where his grandchildren now visited their grandfather. The keeper of the privy purse raised uncomfortable questions about Andrew's financial sustainability. The annual costs of maintaining Royal Lodge properly were estimated at £400,000 minimum. Andrew's income, while substantial by ordinary standards, consisted primarily of his naval pension and returns on investments. Without the commercial income that had previously supplemented his royal allowance, these maintenance costs represented a significant portion of his available resources. Charles listened to his brother's arguments, but remained unmoved. The monarchy faced public scrutiny over its use of resources, and Royal Lodge had become a symbol of royal privilege that seemed disconnected from modern realities. Public opinion polls showed growing criticism of Andrew maintaining such grand accommodations while ordinary Britons faced cost-of-living pressures. The meeting concluded without resolution, but both sides understood that the status quo was unsustainable. Charles gave Andrew time to consider alternative arrangements, while making clear that the current situation needed to change. The king's preference for Frogmore Cottage was stated directly. It would provide Andrew with appropriate accommodation while freeing Royal Lodge for purposes more aligned with current priorities. Andrew left the meeting feeling cornered but not defeated. He immediately contacted his legal advisors to review the lease agreement and explore his options. The 75-year lease was solid, but legal rights meant little if the practical pressures became unbearable. His lawyers advised him to document all communications and ensure he met every requirement of his lease agreement perfectly. Meanwhile, Sarah Ferguson found herself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. Her living arrangements at Royal Lodge had never been formally documented. She was there as Andrew's guest and co-parent, not as a tenant with rights. Any pressure on Andrew to leave would inevitably affect her situation as well. She began quietly exploring her own options while publicly maintaining loyalty to Andrew's fight to stay. The financial investigation into Andrew's ability to maintain Royal Lodge intensified. Accountants pored over his income sources, investment returns, and expense patterns. The picture that emerged was concerning. While Andrew was not facing immediate financial crisis, the cost of Royal Lodge represented an unsustainable percentage of his long-term resources. His naval pension provided a solid foundation, but it was designed to support a comfortable retirement, not the lifestyle of a duke maintaining a royal residence. Investment returns had been affected by market volatility, and some business relationships had become strained by his controversial public profile. The mathematics were stark. Without significant additional income, Andrew could not afford to maintain Royal Lodge indefinitely. This financial pressure created opportunities for the Crown Estate to apply leverage. While they could not simply evict Andrew from a legally binding lease, they could enforce maintenance standards that would make occupancy financially impossible. Royal Lodge was a Grade II listed building with specific conservation requirements. Any failure to maintain these standards could provide grounds for lease termination. Andrew found himself in the unusual position of needing to prove his financial capability to maintain the property he had called home for 20 years. He commissioned independent surveys to document the property's condition and contracted with specialists to ensure all maintenance was performed to exacting standards. Every expense became a strategic investment in his legal position. The media attention surrounding the Royal Lodge situation intensified throughout the spring. Photographers maintained constant surveillance of the property boundaries, hoping to capture images that might indicate Andrew's emotional state or reveal details about his daily routine. Long-lens cameras positioned on public footpaths could monitor much of the estate's activity, making privacy increasingly difficult. Local residents began to express frustration with the media circus surrounding their neighbor. What had once been a quiet corner of Windsor Great Park now regularly featured television trucks, photographers with telephoto lenses, and reporters conducting interviews with anyone willing to comment on Andrew's situation. The disruption affected property values and quality of life throughout the area. Andrew's isolation at Royal Lodge became more pronounced as former friends and associates distanced themselves from his controversy. Social invitations declined, and business opportunities dried up. The grand entertaining spaces that had once hosted shooting parties and charity events now echoed with emptiness. Staff members noticed their employer spending more time alone in his private quarters, emerging mainly for walks in the gardens or business meetings with his legal team. The maintenance staff faced their own challenges as the situation dragged on. Uncertainty about their long-term employment made it difficult to plan personal finances or make long-term commitments. Some began quietly seeking alternative positions, while others remained loyal to Andrew despite uncertain prospects. The household's morale suffered as everyone waited for resolution of the property's future. Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie found themselves caught between loyalty to their father and understanding of the broader family dynamics. Both maintained regular contact with Andrew and continued bringing their children to visit Royal Lodge. However, they also understood King Charles's position and the pressures facing the monarchy. Their diplomatic balancing act required careful navigation of family relationships while avoiding public statements that might inflame the situation. Andrew's business advisors worked to identify additional income sources that might support his position at Royal Lodge. Options were limited by his controversial profile, but some opportunities existed in consulting and advisory roles for companies operating outside the United Kingdom. However, any new business relationships required careful vetting to ensure they would not create additional reputational risks. The summer months brought temporary relief from heating costs, but introduced new expenses related to grounds maintenance and garden care. Royal Lodge's extensive landscaping required year-round attention from professional gardeners and groundskeepers. The swimming pool, tennis court, and other recreational facilities needed regular maintenance, whether they were used frequently or not. Security concerns remained constant and expensive. Andrew's protection requirements were complex due to his family connections and personal history. While he no longer received official protection as a working royal, he required private security arrangements that could cost hundreds of thousands of pounds annually. These expenses were non-negotiable given the real risks associated with his public profile. The racing interests associated with Royal Lodge represented both passion and potential liability. Andrew's involvement with horse breeding and racing required ongoing investment in facilities, staff, and animals. While these activities provided personal satisfaction and some income potential, they also represented significant fixed costs that continued regardless of his overall financial situation. His military connections proved to be among Andrew's most reliable sources of support during this difficult period. Veterans organizations and former service colleagues continued to respect his combat record and military service. These relationships provided emotional support and occasionally opened doors to business opportunities that might not otherwise be available. The helicopter landing pad at Royal Lodge became a symbol of Andrew's changed circumstances. Once used regularly for official travel and family visits, it now sat empty most days. The sight of the unused facility reminded staff and visitors alike of how dramatically Andrew's lifestyle had changed since losing his royal titles and duties. Estate planning considerations added another layer of complexity to Andrew's situation. Royal Lodge represented his most significant asset, but it was also his most expensive liability. Financial advisors struggled to develop long-term strategies that would provide security for Andrew while preserving inheritance options for his daughters and grandchildren. The local economy around Windsor Great Park felt ripple effects from uncertainty about Andrew's future. Suppliers who had relied on Royal Lodge for significant business began hedging their bets by developing alternative customer relationships. Service providers maintained professional relationships while privately questioning the sustainability of their current arrangements. Andrew's personal routine at Royal Lodge adapted to his changed circumstances. Morning walks through the gardens became longer and more frequent, providing both exercise and solitude away from the constant media attention. He spent increasing time in the property's library, reading military histories and biographies of historical figures who had faced similar challenges. The property's private chapel provided another refuge from external pressures. Andrew had always been religious, but the current crisis deepened his spiritual practice. Regular prayer and meditation helped him maintain emotional equilibrium while facing uncertain prospects for his future. Staff noticed changes in Andrew's entertaining patterns. Where once Royal Lodge had hosted regular dinner parties and social events, such gatherings became rare. The grand dining room that had welcomed dozens of guests now typically served only Andrew, Sarah, and visiting family members. The silence in rooms once filled with conversation and laughter was palpable. Legal preparations for potential eviction proceedings became a significant expense and source of stress. Andrew's lawyers developed detailed strategies for defending his lease rights while preparing for various scenarios that might unfold. The legal fees alone represented substantial monthly expenses that further strained his financial resources. The autumn arrived with renewed pressure from the Crown Estate and Buckingham Palace. King Charles's patience with the situation was clearly wearing thin, and signals from the palace suggested that more direct action might be forthcoming. Andrew understood that his window for negotiating favorable terms was closing, but he remained determined to fight for his right to stay at the place he had called home for 2 decades. As the second year of his title-less existence drew to a close, Andrew faced the reality that his battle for Royal Lodge was entering a more serious phase. The financial pressures were mounting, the political pressure was intensifying, and his options were becoming more limited with each passing month. Yet he remained in the Grand Mansion, still fighting for his right to call Royal Lodge his forever home. The third winter at Royal Lodge brought Andrew face to face with realities he could no longer ignore. The heating bills alone for December exceeded £15,000, a stark reminder of the property's massive running costs. As he sat in his study reviewing financial statements, the numbers painted an increasingly clear picture. Maintaining Royal Lodge was becoming financially impossible, regardless of his legal rights or emotional attachments. Sarah Ferguson had been unusually quiet during their morning coffee routine. She understood the pressures better than anyone, having shared both the glory years and the current struggles. Her own position remained precarious. Without formal residency rights, she depended entirely on Andrew's ability to maintain his lease. The unspoken tension between them reflected their shared uncertainty about the future. The Crown Estate had begun conducting more frequent inspections of Royal Lodge, ostensibly to ensure lease compliance, but clearly applying pressure. Each inspection revealed minor maintenance issues that required immediate attention and expense. The Grade 2 listing meant that all repairs had to meet heritage standards, making even simple fixes costly and time-consuming. Andrew suspected these inspections were designed to build a case for lease violations, but He meticulously addressed every requirement to maintain his legal position. His daughter's visits had become more carefully planned affairs. Beatrice and Eugenie continued to support their father, but they were also acutely aware of the broader family dynamics. King Charles had made his displeasure clear through intermediaries, and the sisters found themselves serving as unofficial diplomatic channels between their father and uncle. Their children still enjoyed visiting Royal Lodge, but the adults' conversations increasingly focused on contingency planning. Andrew's business advisor delivered harsh news during a January meeting. The consultant's analysis suggested that Andrew's current income could support Royal Lodge maintenance for perhaps 2 more years, assuming no major repairs or unexpected expenses. Beyond that timeline, he would need either dramatic cost reductions or significant new income sources. Neither option seemed realistic given his current circumstances and limited business opportunities. The psychological toll of the situation was becoming apparent to those closest to Andrew. Staff members noticed their employer's increasing irritability and moments of melancholy that seemed to reflect the weight of his circumstances. The man who had once moved through Royal Lodge with confident authority now often appeared burdened by the very grandeur that surrounded him. Princess Anne's unexpected visit in February provided both support and sobering perspective. The Princess Royal had always been direct in her communications, and this conversation proved no exception. She understood Andrew's emotional attachment to Royal Lodge, but emphasized the practical realities facing the monarchy and the family. Her advice was characteristically blunt. Find a face-saving exit strategy before circumstances forced a less dignified departure. The conversation with and crystallized Andrew's growing awareness that his fight might ultimately be futile. Even if he could maintain the property financially for another year or two, the political and family pressures were unlikely to diminish. King Charles's vision for the monarchy had no place for a controversial ex-duke maintaining a grand residence at crown expense, regardless of lease technicalities. Security concerns added another dimension to Andrew's challenges. Several incidents involving protesters at the Royal Lodge gates had required police intervention. While the demonstrations remained peaceful, they illustrated Andrew's continued visibility as a target for public anger. Each incident generated negative media coverage and reminded everyone that Royal Lodge's prominent resident remained a lightning rod for controversy. The local police commander requested a meeting to discuss ongoing security challenges. The cost of providing adequate protection for Andrew at such an exposed location was straining local resources. While they would continue to fulfill their duties, the commander suggested that a smaller, more secure residence might better serve everyone's interests. The conversation was professionally diplomatic, but carried clear implications about the sustainability of current arrangements. Andrew's military pension provider conducted a routine review that raised uncomfortable questions about his living expenses. While the pension was secure, administrators noted that his lifestyle appeared inconsistent with typical retirement patterns for former naval officers. The review concluded without adverse action, but it served as another reminder that Andrew's circumstances were being scrutinized from multiple directions. The Royal Lodge staff began receiving inquiries from employment agencies, suggesting that word was spreading through domestic service networks about potential changes at the property. Several long-term employees requested private conversations with Andrew about their job security. While he provided reassurances, everyone understood that his ability to guarantee continued employment was limited by factors beyond his control. Sarah Ferguson's media appearances became more frequent and strategic during this period. Her interviews carefully avoided direct discussion of Royal Lodge while emphasizing family unity and her continued co-parenting relationship with Andrew. These appearances seemed designed to maintain public sympathy for the family while avoiding statements that might complicate legal or political negotiations. The gardens at Royal Lodge required significant investment as spring approached. Winter damage to landscaping and infrastructure needed repair, and the annual gardening program required planning and budgeting. Andrew found himself making difficult decisions about which improvements were essential and which could be deferred. Each choice reflected his uncertain timeline for remaining at the property. A confidential meeting between Andrew's representatives and Crown Estate officials explored potential compromise arrangements. Various scenarios were discussed, including reduced occupancy areas, shared usage arrangements, or modified lease terms that might address both sides' concerns. However, these discussions revealed the fundamental incompatibility between Andrew's desire to maintain his current lifestyle and the Crown Estate's commercial objectives. King Charles invited Andrew to Windsor Castle for what would prove to be their most serious conversation about Royal Lodge. The king's position had hardened over the winter months, influenced by public opinion polls showing growing criticism of royal expenses and privileges. Charles made clear that Andrew's continued occupation of Royal Lodge was becoming politically unsustainable for the monarchy as a whole. The conversation at Windsor Castle lasted 3 hours and covered every aspect of the Royal Lodge situation. Charles acknowledged his brother's emotional attachment to the property and his legal rights under the lease agreement. However, he also explained the broader pressures facing the monarchy and his responsibility to manage royal resources in ways that maintain public support. The discussion concluded with Charles giving Andrew until summer to develop an acceptable transition plan. Andrew's legal team intensified their review of all options following the Windsor Castle meeting. They explored every possible strategy for maintaining Royal Lodge occupancy, including legal challenges to Crown Estate authority and appeals based on lease agreement protections. However, their analysis consistently returned to the same conclusion. While Andrew might win legal battles, he was unlikely to win the broader war against family and political pressure. The financial analysis became even more sobering as spring expenses mounted. Garden restoration, routine maintenance, and security costs created a relentless drain on Andrew's resources. His accountants projected that maintaining current standards would exhaust his liquid assets within 18 months, forcing him into debt or asset sales that would compromise his long-term financial security. Media coverage of the Royal Lodge situation intensified as speculation grew about Andrew's eventual departure. Royal correspondents began reporting on potential alternative residences, with Frogmore Cottage mentioned as the most likely destination. These reports created additional pressure by making Andrew's situation appear inevitable to public observers. The Queen's former dresser, who had known Andrew since childhood, provided unexpected perspective during a private conversation. She reminded him that Royal Lodge had always been intended as a temporary arrangement in royal terms. Even 75 years was brief by institutional standards. Her gentle suggestion that dignity lay in choosing one's own timing rather than having departure forced resonated more deeply than Andrew initially cared to admit. Andrew's evening walks through the Royal Lodge grounds took on new meaning as he contemplated their possible end. Each familiar path, every carefully maintained garden bed, and all the improvements he had funded over 20 years represented memories and investments that might soon belong to someone else. The approaching summer deadline made every sunset feel potentially significant. His relationship with the property's wildlife had become a source of comfort during these difficult months. The deer that grazed in the early morning hours, the birds that nested in century-old trees, and the smaller creatures that called the gardens home remained unchanged by human politics. Their presence reminded Andrew that Royal Lodge would continue its natural cycles regardless of who held the lease. The helicopter pad received its first use in months when Princess Eugenie and her family arrived for what everyone understood might be among their final visits to Royal Lodge as their family home. The children played in the gardens while the adults discussed practical matters related to personal belongings, family heirlooms, and emotional preparations for potential relocation. Andrew commissioned a professional photography session to document Royal Lodge's current condition and his family's connection to the property. The images would serve multiple purposes: legal documentation of property care, personal memories for family archives, and potential evidence of his stewardship investment if future negotiations required such proof. The racing stables presented another complex challenge in any potential departure planning. Andrew's horses and breeding interests represented both passion and investment, but they also tied him to Royal Lodge in ways that would be difficult to replicate elsewhere. The logistics of relocating equine operations added another layer of complexity to any transition planning. His private chapel visits became daily occurrences as the pressure mounted. Andrew found solace in prayer and meditation that helped him maintain perspective amid the swirling controversies. The chapel's peaceful atmosphere provided refuge from external pressures and space for contemplating decisions that would affect not just his own future, but his family's legacy. The summer deadline established by King Charles approached with relentless inevitability. Andrew understood that his options were narrowing to a simple choice: negotiate his own departure terms while he still had leverage, or face more dramatic pressure that might force less favorable outcomes. The battle for Royal Lodge was entering its final phase, and Andrew needed to decide whether continued resistance served his interests or merely delayed the inevitable. The decisive moment came during a humid July afternoon when Andrew received notification that the Crown Estate intended to conduct a comprehensive structural survey of Royal Lodge. The official language was bureaucratic and polite, but the message was unmistakable. They were building a case for either major expenditure requirements that would force his departure or potential lease violations that could justify termination. Andrew stood in the library where he had received the notice, surrounded by leather-bound volumes that had witnessed centuries of royal drama. The irony was not lost on him that many of these books chronicled the falls of nobles who had overestimated their ability to resist institutional power. History was filled with examples of individuals who had fought too long and lost everything versus those who had negotiated strategic retreats that preserved their dignity and remaining assets. Sarah found him there an hour later, the letter still in his hands. Their conversation was brief, but decisive. She had been conducting her own quiet negotiations with palace officials, exploring arrangements that might allow both of them to transition gracefully while maintaining family relationships. Her pragmatic approach had always complemented his more emotional responses to crisis, and now her level-headed analysis provided the perspective he needed. The children, Beatrice and Eugenie, arrived that evening for what became known within the family as the Royal Lodge Summit. The sisters had coordinated their approach carefully, understanding that their father needed to hear unified family support for a strategic withdrawal rather than continued resistance. Their presentation was respectful but firm. Continuing to fight would likely result in total defeat, while negotiating now might preserve options and relationships. Beatrice's analysis was particularly compelling. As someone involved in charitable work and public appearances, she understood the reputational dynamics affecting the entire family. Andrew's continued occupation of Royal Lodge was becoming a liability not just for him, but for his daughters and their children. The negative publicity was affecting their own charitable efforts and public relationships in ways that would only worsen over time. Eugenie's perspective focused on practical matters and future planning. She had researched alternative properties and arrangements that might provide Andrew with appropriate housing while dramatically reducing his expenses. Her findings suggested several options that would allow him to maintain dignity while acknowledging changed circumstances. Most importantly, these alternatives would preserve financial resources for his grandchildren's futures. The family meeting extended through the weekend, with each member of the household contributing perspectives and concerns. Staff representatives were included in appropriate discussions, ensuring that their interests were considered in any transition planning. The groundskeepers, housekeepers, security personnel, and other employees had devoted years to Royal Lodge, and their futures deserve consideration alongside family interests. Andrew's financial advisors presented updated analysis that removed any remaining illusions about sustainability. The comprehensive review showed that maintaining Royal Lodge would exhaust his available resources within 12 to 15 months under optimal conditions. Any unexpected expenses, major repairs, increased security needs, or economic downturns affecting his investments would accelerate the timeline dramatically. The legal team's final assessment acknowledged that while Andrew's lease provided strong protections, the practical pressures had made his position untenable. Crown Estate's technical requirements could be escalated to levels that would make compliance financially impossible. More importantly, the broader family and institutional pressure meant that even legal victories would be Pyrrhic, winning battles while losing the war and destroying relationships in the process. King Charles requested a final meeting in early August, this time at Balmoral where the family traditionally gathered for summer holidays. The setting was deliberate. Conversations at Balmoral carried the weight of family tradition and institutional memory. Andrew arrived knowing that this meeting would likely determine the final terms of his departure from Royal Lodge. The Balmoral discussion was conducted with the formality appropriate to its significance. King Charles was accompanied by his private secretary and the keeper of the privy purse, while Andrew brought his legal advisor and financial consultant. The conversation covered every aspect of the transition, from practical logistics to financial arrangements to public communication strategies. Charles offered terms that were more generous than Andrew had expected. The Crown Estate would purchase Andrew's improvement investments at a fair market valuation, providing him with several £1 million to support his transition. Frogmore Cottage would be available at nominal rent with maintenance support for an initial period. Most importantly, the transition would be announced as Andrew's decision, allowing him to maintain dignity while acknowledging changed circumstances. The offer included provisions for Andrew's staff, with Crown Estate committing to interview current employees for positions at other royal properties. The racing interest could be relocated to facilities at Windsor Great Park, maintaining Andrew's breeding and training operations while reducing his direct property obligations. These terms addressed most of the practical concerns that had made departure seem so difficult. Andrew requested time to review the offer with his family and advisors, but everyone understood that these terms represented the best outcome available under current circumstances. The alternative, continued resistance leading to forced departure under less favorable conditions, would serve no one's interests and would likely destroy family relationships that Andrew valued above property considerations. The weekend consultation with family members confirmed what Andrew already knew in his heart. Beatrice and Eugenie supported accepting the Crown Estate offer, viewing it as an honorable resolution that preserved their father's financial security while allowing family healing to begin. Sarah Ferguson agreed, noting that their continued co-parenting relationship would be easier to maintain without the stress and expense of fighting for Royal Lodge. The formal acceptance was delivered to Buckingham Palace on a Tuesday morning in late August. Andrew's letter acknowledged the changing circumstances of his role within the royal family and expressed his decision to transition to more appropriate accommodation. The language was carefully crafted to present the move as his choice rather than forced departure, preserving dignity while accepting reality. Crown Estate's response was swift and professional. Surveys and valuations began immediately with expert assessments of Andrew's improvements and current property condition. The process was conducted with discretion and respect, acknowledging the emotional significance of the transition while maintaining business-like efficiency in practical matters. Media management became crucial as news of Andrew's decision began to circulate. Palace communications officials worked with Andrew's representatives to develop statements that emphasized his voluntary transition and continued family relationships. The narrative focused on practical considerations and changing circumstances rather than conflicts or forced departures. The packing process began in September, with professional moving services coordinating the transfer of 20 years' worth of personal belongings, family heirlooms, and household contents. Each room of Royal Lodge held memories and items that needed careful consideration. Some would move to Frogmore Cottage, others would go to storage, and some would be distributed to family members or donated to charity. Andrew's personal effects told the story of his life at Royal Lodge. Naval memorabilia from his military service, family photographs spanning decades, gifts from official visits and charitable events, and personal items that had made the mansion feel like home. Each object required decisions about its future, making the packing process emotionally challenging despite its practical necessity. The staff transitions proceeded more smoothly than expected. Several key personnel accepted positions at other royal properties, while others chose to seek employment elsewhere with strong references and generous severance packages. The head groundskeeper was offered a position maintaining Windsor Castle Gardens, ensuring continuity for someone who had devoted 15 years to Royal Lodge landscaping. Frogmore Cottage underwent modifications to accommodate Andrew's specific needs and preferences. While significantly smaller than Royal Lodge, the cottage could be configured to provide comfortable accommodation for Andrew and Sarah, with appropriate spaces for family visits and limited entertaining. Security arrangements were adapted to the new property's requirements and reduced scale. The horses and racing interests relocated to facilities within Windsor Great Park, maintaining Andrew's breeding and training operations while eliminating the direct property management responsibilities that had become so expensive at Royal Lodge. This arrangement preserved his passion and investment in racing while adapting to his changed financial circumstances. The final weeks at Royal Lodge were bittersweet. Andrew spent considerable time in each room, reflecting on memories and experiences that had defined 20 years of his life. The children's playrooms where Beatrice and Eugenie had grown up, the formal dining room that had hosted countless guests, the private study where he had conducted business and managed his affairs. Each space held significance that would be difficult to replicate elsewhere. His last morning walk through the Royal Lodge grounds occurred on a crisp October day that reminded him of his first arrival at the property decades earlier. The gardens he had lovingly developed remained immaculate, a testament to his stewardship and investment. The deer grazing in the distance and birds singing in ancient trees seemed unchanged by human drama, providing perspective on the temporary nature of his occupancy. The keys were formally returned to Crown Estate representatives in a brief ceremony that marked the end of Andrew's tenure at Royal Lodge. The transition was conducted with dignity and respect, acknowledging his care for the property while formally concluding his lease agreement. Palace officials expressed appreciation for his stewardship and wished him well in his new accommodation. Frogmore Cottage welcomed Andrew and Sarah on a sunny November afternoon, with staff and security already in place to ensure a smooth transition. While dramatically different from Royal Lodge in scale and grandeur, the cottage offered comfort, security, and proximity to family that made the change bearable. The reduced expenses would allow Andrew to maintain his lifestyle without the financial stress that had dominated recent years. The public announcement of Andrew's transition was received with mixed reactions. Critics argued that he should have moved years earlier, while supporters praised his eventual recognition of changed circumstances. Most observers viewed the outcome as appropriate. A former working royal adapting his lifestyle to match his current status while maintaining family relationships and personal dignity. King Charles privately expressed satisfaction with the resolution, which removed a source of ongoing tension while preserving family unity. The Royal Lodge property would be available for purposes more aligned with current royal needs, possibly housing working royals or serving institutional functions that would benefit the monarchy's public mission. Andrew's first Christmas at Frogmore Cottage proved that family traditions could survive changes in venue. Beatrice and Eugenie brought their children for holiday celebrations that maintained familiar patterns while adapting to smaller spaces and more intimate settings. The grandchildren quickly adapted to their new environment, finding new games and hiding places in cottage gardens that replaced the vast lawns of Royal Lodge. As winter settled over Windsor Great Park, Andrew reflected on the journey that had brought him from Royal Lodge to Frogmore Cottage. The transition had been painful, but necessary, preserving his financial security and family relationships while acknowledging the reality of his changed circumstances. Royal Lodge would continue its history under new occupants, while Andrew began writing the next chapter of his own story in more modest but sustainable surroundings. The question of whether Royal Lodge would continue as Prince Andrew's forever abode had been definitively answered. The Grand Mansion would not be his final home, but his dignified departure had preserved options and relationships that would serve him well in the years ahead. Sometimes, as Andrew had learned, strategic retreat proved to be the wisest form of victory, allowing survival and future possibilities rather than total defeat through feudal resistance.